Well, hi. Welcome back. I am back after our family's little run-in with COVID, and everyone's doing well. Thank you so much for your prayers and concerns. Um, we are all on the mend and back to work and school. So our podcast is coming a little bit late this time. We are going back into James in James chapter 4. If you have your Bibles, you can dig into that. But we're not quite ready to give up Christmas yet. I'm not anyway, at least. I was reading this in 2001. The Richards family of Canberra, Australia, set the Guinness World Record for the most holiday lights ever to grace a human house. 331,038 bulbs, to be exact. The family's retina scorching record stood for more than a decade. Then in 2012, Tim Gay and his family from Grangeville, New York, bested the Richardses. They decorated their house with 346,283 lights. Many of those were to add tinsel to injury, synchronized to music. The Richardses couldn't stand to be losers, so they upped the ante by decorating their house with more than 502,165 lights. This equates to more than 29 miles of wire. But there is, of course, always room for more light. So this year, our heroes from New York got their revenge. They covered their own house, and crucially its grounds, with a display that involves 601,736 lights. The whole thing took roughly 2 months to build. It spans 2 acres. It also involves much more than lights. It includes more than 200 songs, including both top 40 hits and traditional holiday songs. As Tim Gay told Guinness on the occasion of his win, "My family and I are thrilled to bring the world record back to the United States," he added, "and we're even more excited that we did it with nearly 100,000 more lights than the previous record." But the good news is that neither family forgot the true meaning of Christmas. They kept the Jesus in Christmas. Oh my goodness. Personally, I can't wait to take down our Christmas lights. It was a half-hearted effort, to say the least, this year. We aren't winning any awards or breaking any records other than for the lamest holiday light display in the neighborhood. Carrie wanted lights, and I didn't want to climb up on the roof and didn't want to poke holes in our house, so I hung them on the little gutter we have in front and wrapped them around one of the posts on our porch. Called it good. It's not that I don't like Christmas lights. It's that I'm cheap and I'm afraid of heights. So climbing all over the house, putting up expensive lights is not my idea of a good time. But I'm gonna have to be I'm gonna have to be a little more purposeful next year. And heaven forbid when we have grandkids, I'm gonna have to come up with a whole new lighting display and setup. But for now, I'm squeaking by with being a Scrooge. But Christmas is barely over. Even now, it still feels like Christmas is lingering. And it's time for us to look ahead into what comes next. And for us, that means heading back to the book of James to pick up where we left off before Advent. Let's jump into our scripture today. Chapter 4, verse 1. Having mental dyslexia today. Chapter 4, verse 1. Says this: "What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You're jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. Do you think the scriptures have no meaning? They say that God is passionate, that the Spirit He has placed within us should be faithful to Him. And He gives grace generously, as the scriptures say. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourself before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts. For your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up in honor. Wow. Well, here is a stern rebuke from James. It's a good thing that that doesn't happen in churches anymore, right? I mean, we've all read James, so there shouldn't be a problem. Correct? Well, I can tell you, when I was a brand new pastor, when I first started out as a pastor in Gresham, Oregon, I had a delightful little church in Gresham, Oregon, full of wonderful people who loved Jesus and did their best to love one another. I told them in a very James-like sermon, I kind of laid down the law. Boy, I put the rubber down and it met the road, and things were flying. And it was so inspiring that I said, let's just do this. I'm going to just keep preaching this same sermon until we do it. Well, I didn't. Of course, I didn't preach the same sermon over and over again. But that was part of my naivety as a young man, as a young preacher, was that I assumed was once you knew something, that knowledge would change you, that it would change your behavior. But we know that that's not true, that knowledge by itself doesn't really change behavior. There has to be a heart change for behavior to change. All right, let's dive into this a little bit. What is causing fights and quarrels among you? James answers his own question. He says in verse 2, the reason that they're fighting is because you want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You're jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Doesn't this sound like kind of a generic definition of most conflict? We're thwarted. We can't get what we think we need, so we fight. And if you're thinking this sounds vaguely geopolitical the way it describes conflict, you want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it, you'd be correct. These are national terms of war that James is using. Interestingly, to me, he compares our motivations and desires with the same ones that start wars of unimaginable suffering and devastation. He's equating the two to be equal. This is serious business within the church. He isn't talking here about Russia invading the Ukraine or geopolitical moves. He is talking about life inside the church. Surely this kind of conflict doesn't happen within the church. Well, I don't think we're killing each other over things in the literal sense of the word. But if you've been in church long enough, you know that there are hard words that are spoken, and sometimes those hard words are difficult to take back or to be forgiven for. And bitterness can take root in the family, and we have to root that out. We can't allow bitterness to take root in our lives or in the church. John Ortberg notes, he says, the bigger our sense of entitlement, the smaller our sense of gratitude. Our entitlement mindset has led to a proliferation of lawsuits. When we don't get something we really want, we sue somebody. For example, the San Francisco Giants were once sued for passing out Father's Day gifts to men only. A psychology professor sued for sexual harassment because of the presence of mistletoe at a Christmas party. A psychic was awarded $986,000 when a doctor's CAT scan impaired her psychic abilities. You have to wonder about this third one. If she really was a psychic, shouldn't she have known not to go to that doctor in the first place, says Ortberg. Jealousy, says James, drives us to want what others have. Now, I'm preaching this the day after Christmas. Originally, the podcast, it had a little COVID delay to it. But you can remember what you got for Christmas. It hasn't been that long. And unless you're 9 years old, you probably didn't need much to start with and probably got what you wanted for Christmas anyway. Let's face it, grown-ups are hard to buy for. There isn't a lot that we truly need that we don't already have. So the timing of this message may be bad, but let's move past the gifts. How is your life? How is your sleep? How is your anxiety? How is your health or the health of your spouse? How are things when you're alone and it's quiet and it's nobody but you and God? Now let's talk more about jealousy. Don't you wish that you could sleep like, look like, eat like, and be like blank? I mean, fill in the blank. We've got that person or people in our lives that we look at and go, if only I still looked like that, if only I still felt like that, if only I was still that age, if only. It's interesting to me that James says we don't have what we want because we don't ask God, and when we do, it's with the wrong motives. James says that we want to spend the spoils on hedonism and other life pleasure pursuits. But my question this morning is this: what if God can change the wants in your life? What if He can shape our desires to match up with what it is that He desires for us? So that we're not in this constant conflict, pushing back against that which God desires for us, but instead receiving it with humility and open arms, embracing what God has for us. I think God is about changing our desires. I think He's about changing our wants from those things that we do just to simplify and please ourselves to deeper wants, to wants that carry a greater perspective, a deeper sense to them. I think that's what James is talking about here. The conversion of our wants, those things that we fight over passionately, into the very thing God longs for us to be passionate about. So what do we do with James? Well, verse 7 gives us another clue here. James doesn't hide the ball very often. Pretty much, if you look at James, he'll tell it just like it is. And in verse 7, he gives us the answer. He says, "Humble yourselves, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you." Humble ourselves. What does that even mean here, James? Well, I think it means two things. The first is to not take yourself so seriously. And the second is to revisit your wants, your real wants, with God. Bring your wants into communion with God and see what happens. But we need to start by not taking ourselves so seriously. John Ortberg tried to teach his daughter about money. He said when our kids were little, we put them on the envelope system. We gave them an allowance. They would put it in envelopes and labeled give, save, gifts, spend, and so on. I thought it was working until one day I had a Band-Aid on my arm, and my daughter, who at the time was about 6, asked why. I explained that I'd gotten a medical exam that day to get life insurance. She asked, "What's that?" I explained, "Well, Daddy loves you so much and loves the family so much, so if anything were to happen to Daddy, which of course it won't, but if it would provide for $250,000. Her eyes got really wide. She has a tender heart, and I knew she'd be worried. She looked up at me and said, "A piece?" And I thought, I'm not sure the right lesson is getting communicated here. Sometimes we make a big deal out of things that aren't really a big deal. And we see this right now, this pandemonium over news and media. This fight over what is fake news and what is fear-mongering and what is real news and what can be trusted. And we live in an age and a time where how you get your news and where you get your news says as much about you as so many parts of and so many aspects of our faith. It's unreal, the times that we're living in. But we make such a big deal out of things. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who was worked up over something in the news, and he was just apoplectic about it and said, I don't know what I can do. What do I do, Brian? What do I do? And I had no answers for him. He had legitimate concerns, but if I could say anything to him now, kind of post-conversation, slip a suggestion in his mind, I would say this: don't take it so seriously, because all of these things that were being flushed into our faces, that are being sent down the pipes, and that we're getting both barrels right in our face of all of this information and misinformation, whether it's COVID or politics or you name it. I think we just need to pump the brakes and not take all of this as seriously as the media would like us to take it, because it's clickbait. It gets them more views, and more views means more ratings, and more ratings is more money, and that's what it's all about. It's sad, but it's true. It's really all about the clicks and the money. But we know this, don't we? I thought so. Taking ourselves less seriously is exhilarating. It is not taking God more lightly. In fact, I find the inverse is true. The more serious I take myself, the less serious I take God and what God has for my life. The less serious I take myself and my life, the more seriously I take the things of God. The more seriously God becomes a factor in my everyday. And that's what we want, isn't it? It is taking God seriously enough that we are content in His love for us. There's a security in love versus an insecurity that we face when we're not sure if we're loved. When things were not going great for Carrie and I, everything had the potential to turn into a fight. We fought because we couldn't talk to each other anymore because we were insecure in each other's love. Everything became a trigger for a confrontation because our love for each other just felt unstable. It felt like we were on shaky ground, so we tended to fight, each digging in on every issue, taking everything quite seriously. And I will tell you, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. It's taken years to recover from that. Second thing we need to do, James says, is I think we need to revisit our real wants with God. We have to differentiate between what we want for pleasure or for hedonism. That's the philosophy that the greatest good is pleasure, and that should be the pursuit of life. And what we truly desire, which is communion with a holy God. Let me read that again. We have to differentiate between what we want for pleasure or hedonism and what we truly desire, which is communion with the holy God. You see, there's things that we want, like I want a piece of chocolate. And then there's things that we want, like I want $1 million in my IRA account. The depth and the connection between those two I wants is the key. The things that we want on the surface, generally, if we didn't get them, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But the things of God, the things that God gives us, that's what we're concentrating on. Those are the things, those things that flow out of our communion with God. Our true wants and our true needs, our deepest needs, are those that come from our communion with God. And we've got to be able to differentiate between what is a little L or little W want and what is a big W want or need. Take the alcoholic. Why does he drink? Well, that's a complex answer usually. There's elements of addiction and alcoholism that are biological, like some mental illnesses. And in other words, his brain is broken. He can't cope, so he drinks. Life gets worse. Can't cope, so he drinks. Rinse, dry, repeat until his life's a disaster in the garbage heap and he's at rock bottom. And then he has to decide what he really wants and whether he wants to live or stay locked in his tomb of insobriety. What he wants is really far deeper than alcohol. It's love and hope. It's the security of being unconditionally loved. Because of his brokenness, he cannot love himself, and it leaves a gaping hole in his soul. You cannot love yourself when you think of yourself as a monster, as broken beyond repair. It doesn't work. You need someone to come along and say, God is not done with you yet. There's still hope. If the alcoholic stopped drinking, that brokenness would still be there. That's what God works at healing in us when we give our lives to Him, is our brokenness. These are our deepest needs. These are our true wants. James is right that most of the time we're just selfish in our wants. We need to seek out those things that God wants for us, what our true needs are, and seek out those things. Ortberg wrote again, and he said, "We were with friends at an open-air street fair when we spotted a mechanical bull that tries to buck people off. The guy operating the bull said, 'Watching isn't nearly as fun as riding.' So I told the bull operator that I wanted to ride. He took one look at my middle-aged body and asked, 'Are you sure?' That guaranteed that I would not back down. He explained to me that the bull has 12 levels of difficulty. It might not be easy, he said, but the key is you have to stay centered on the bull. You have to follow the bull. You have to shift your center of gravity as the bull moves.' So I got on the bull, and it started slow, and then it started moving faster and jostling around, and I was holding on real tight. And then I remembered his advice, so I loosened up and it kept moving faster and jolting and bucking and jumping. I was hanging on sideways. My arms were flailing all over the place. I just hung on, and finally the bull slowed down and it stopped, and I was still on the bull. It wasn't pretty, but I made it. I imagined how surprised the operator of the bull would be that I had triumphed, so I looked over at him, and he looked over at me. Shaking his head, he smiled and said, "Nice job." That was level 1. What a picture, though, of a man trying to stay on a bucking bull. We need to stay in harmony with God, in rhythm with God in our lives. We need to come before God and seek the things that God desires, that God really wants, until they come to the place that they are replacing our petty wants. It's our petty wants that need to go. But what a picture. We need to work in rhythm with God if we're going to stay centered in this life. If we're going to hang on, we've got to work with God and not fight God at every corner and at every turn. James continues in verse 11. He says, "Don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you're criticizing and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you." So what law are we breaking when we speak evil and criticize each other? Remember when they came and asked Jesus what the most important commandment was? And he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. That one. That one right there. It says, obey. Don't judge whether it applies to you. I found this personally to be a little bit challenging because there's a part of me, and as a scholar, I want to pick at everything. And I want to get down to the answers and find out what the real questions are and, get into something and dig into it and question it and challenge it until it proves itself true. Then I keep it and I hold on to it. It's kind of how I operate. So when James says to just basically shut up and obey, there's a part of me that bristles at that. I don't like that. I don't just obey. I thoughtfully obey. I discriminatorily obey. Discriminatorily? Yes. With discrimination, I obey. I just don't blindly obey because somebody said so. I want to know why. I've always wanted to know why. It's really annoying to some people, but I want to know why before I do something. Has to make sense. So why is he saying, don't judge whether it applies to you, just obey? He says that when the rule applies to everyone all the time. Then when we're being discerning, we're just looking for an out. This isn't like a speed limit. This is like gravity. This law of treating others how we would like to be treated and treating one another fairly, not speaking ill against each other, not tearing one another down, treating each other how we'd like to be treated, Jesus' law, his golden rule. When it applies all the time, then when we look at ways to around it, all we're looking for are outs. There, you can escape gravity. If you go high enough out of orbit, you can escape gravity. You can find your out. You can be an astronaut and float around in space. But realistically, gravity will come back into play. There are some things that we just as Christians don't have an option on. And loving one another is one of those things. When do we discern that it doesn't apply in this situation? For some other complex reason, love doesn't apply to this person? Well, you don't know what they've done. They don't deserve my love. They don't deserve mercy. They don't deserve... Well, neither did we. And Christ came for us anyway. Andy Stanley writes, and he said, I used to do a lot of marriage counseling, and often one spouse would come in the office and start ranting and raving. My husband does this. My wife will never do that. And on it would go, on and on. I would sit there thinking, this counseling isn't going to be very effective because the person who apparently needs to change isn't even in the room. So I would get a pad of paper, draw a circle on it, and say, this is a pie that represents all the chaos in your marriage. Now 100% of the blame is in that pie because that's where all the chaos is. I would give them the pen and say, I want you to draw a slice of pie that you think represents your responsibility for the chaos. The piece of pie that client would draw was never very big, but I would say, okay, so why don't you and I talk about just this? Let's talk about this piece that is your responsibility. Let's talk about your slice. You know what? My approach never worked, he says. I could never get anyone to stay on his or her slice of the pie. So here's what I want you to do this week. As you experience relational conflict at work, at home, with your friends, any conflict of any sort, big or small, stop and think about your own slice of the pie. Ask yourself, what is in my slice of the pie? Have I taken responsibility for my life, really? Or am I enjoying the blame game so much that it has allowed me to ignore what I'm ultimately responsible for? In any relationship, if you can ever get the two parties to own their own piece of the pie, you can make progress. But if everybody is focused on the other person's slice of the pie, you'll still just have chaos. Our job, James says, is to practice the law of love, not to try and wiggle out of it. Makes sense. So he's rebuked our fighting and he's called for humility. He's reminded us not to judge and slander one another. And then James finishes his chapter with this, verse 13. Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we're going to a certain town and we'll stay there for a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it is sin to know that what you ought to do and then not ought to do it, and then not do it. So what do we make of this final piece of the chapter? Well, it connects with his call for humility and love. Is it okay to make plans? Sure. Of course, we need to make plans. We're flying to Arizona this spring for my nephew's wedding down in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the airline has changed the time on us already twice. We have had to call and change that back, and we're trying to make plans, and we need to get an enhanced driver's license, and we need to go through all of these hoops just to fly down to Arizona. And we have to plan for that. There has to be steps that are taken and plans that are made. Farmers don't just randomly decide at the last minute what they're going to plant that year. They know going into the year what they're going to plant, and they're betting on the markets doing well with whatever there is that they're planting, or their fields doing well with what they're planting. Of course, we need to plan. I think James's point is, don't take the Lord out of your plans. We like to plan and plan and plan and plan and plan and plan and then ask God to bless it all. When the reality of it is, we should be asking God, God, what is it that you have planned for me? What is it that you have in store for me? And then be sensitive to the Holy Spirit. Be sensitive to God's leading. So is it okay to make plans? Yes. But we need to make our plans in conjunction with God. This takes discernment and it takes practice. I love you all. Have a wonderful Lord's Day. Take care.